Cool. All right, guys, thanks for coming to this really weird room today. I showed up here and there was a virtual class going on, and that was like, can I just rearrange the class? They were like, sure. So we're doing our best. We could have had like screens everywhere around the room, but I'm trying to make this like a seminar. Next week we'll be back at the usual location. We just got booted for this week, and then one more week at the end of the quarter. But maybe we'll try and find another room for that one. So we'll work on that. I also just want to, before turning it over to you to introduce our amazing speaker today, I also just want to thank you. He's co-sponsoring this between the EE seminar series and the Feral. Yeah, Feral seminar series, which is really, really wonderful to have that kind of joint hosting. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Cool. Yeah, and I hope we can do it again. We host 4 or 5 lectures typically every year for the Forest and Fire Ecology Random Lecture Series. And I don't know, well, we started talking about this, and I have a little bit of funding for that, and we thought it would be neat to try to maybe do one of those every once in a while. Maybe we can do it once a quarter. Anyway, very pleased to be able to welcome Solomon Dabrowski back to UC Davis. Solomon is a GGE grad. One of the few who've done really well for themselves. Anyway, he comes back and sees that we don't sweep floors on this campus. Anyway, Solomon is at University of Montana. He's a professor in the Department of Forestry and Management in the College of Forestry and Engineering. And he actually also did your master's here, right? In viticulture. And you got an undergrad in forestry from Berkeley. Yeah. Anyway, all sorts of different degrees in different things. And Solomon's a master of a lot of different things. I met him in 2003-ish, 4-ish, when I was still working in the Forest Service as a regional ecologist, and I found out that Susan Houston and some whippersnapper were doing a vegetation map in the Lake Tahoe Basin, and the Forest Service knew nothing about it. So I checked into it, and I thought, who are these people? Anyway, but they were these people, and turned out to be great. And we've been collaborating ever since. So Solomon is going to be talking about, it's going to be very applied talk, maybe a little bit more than the kind of things he used to sing, but he did a trial run of it this morning at Cal Fire in Sacramento. That's the other thing I do with these. We go over to the CNRA building and always give a lecture there. And they hated it. It was Pan, and he completely changed it over.
I was crying.
Anyway, yeah. Kidding. All right. Anyway, it's yours. Oh, and I want to know, there is a mixer afterwards at 5 at Sophia's. This is the quarter faculty student mixer thing. So drinks are all free. You guys are paying, or how does that work again? Wow, yeah, that's what it is.
I'll be quick.
I'm standing between you and free drinks. It's not a good place to be. Well, thank you for having me back. Thank you for the invite. Thank you for the seminar series. It's super fun to come back to Davis. I have a fond place in my heart for Davis, I must admit. I mean, I live in a beautiful town. Missoula's a great town. It's got mountains everywhere. I was thinking about back to Davis when I always thought to myself as a grad student here, damn, Davis would be so much more awesome if it was 30 miles to the east or west. But I still have like a lot of fondness for the community. We went bike ride, we biked from your place to here. I was just like, oh, the trail network here just reminded me of what it was like to be a grad student here, be carefree, not have teenagers. That's not what you guys came here to hear me talk about, though. I'm going to talk about some work primarily that's been done by a master's student of mine, Lewis Faller. I was just mentioning, like, I'm at that point in my career where I basically talk about other people's work that are in my lab, and I keep them funded, and I try to keep them on the straight and narrow. But basically, I ride on their coattails. They're generally, when I'm lucky, I get really good, brilliant students and postdocs. I'll be highlighting some of them. So really, like, this is their work, and I'll do my best to convey it. So, if there's any real questions, I'll just send them. I'll send you their email.
Oh, don't be good.
I'm going to be talking about basically looking at the last 34 years of planting efforts by the U.S. Forest Service. In a particular context, in the title, it's a little bit, I don't know, actual versus optimal planting site. I put optimal in quotes because it's a loaded term, of course. I don't want to point that out. I know that it's a loaded term, but I'm going to unpack what I mean by optimal in a particular set of lenses and a particular analysis framework. And the hope here really is to develop assessment of what the forest has done in the past, so we can develop tools to improve planning outcomes moving forward. So I'll lead with that. Here's an outline. We don't need to go through it in a lot of detail other than to say, I'll start with kind of this background about what drives post-fire regeneration. To some of you, this may be new. To some of you, it may not be. I'll talk about kind of the reforestation gap, this big chasm between the amount of need for reforestation and what we have capacity to actually do these days. I'm gonna then kind of dive into our methods and analysis findings, and then we'll wrap up. So let's jump right into it for kind of core framing. Drivers of post-fire reforestation. When I think of this problem, I think of two kind of key drivers. One is basically available seeds. Germination, establishment, and growth, right? These are key things that we need to do to basically get forest back onto the landscapes that are burning at high severity. And so this is kind of the process that we're trying to capture through a set of models that I'll be describing today. We'll start with available seeds. And really this all comes down to a tale of two kinds of fires. One of them on the left is a small fire. For example, that's a 1999 high complex fire, which burned about 1,300 hectares in California. And in red, basically, is the high severity patches that you commonly see in small fires. And on the right is the other kind of fire that we're more commonly seeing. That's a 2020 North Complex fire. That's about 128,000 hectares. And when you look at the proportion of high severity burn patches in the two, that's what we're more commonly seeing now. And so when we think about available seeds, we're really increasingly seeing this, and we're thinking about all of these trees that are on the perimeter or patches that might be inside that are having to send propagules of seeds into places that don't have access to a seed source. And so as we shift more towards these large fire regimes and high severity regimes, we are going to increasingly challenge the ability for forests to regenerate, namely through basically a lack of seed supply into these places. When we look at what that translates like, a lot of you have seen these kinds of graphs before, the area burned over time. We see there's been about a 10x increase in area burned over the last 30, 40 years. But in contrast, because of that shift in the size class distribution of fires, we've seen about a 15x increase in the area burned severely, which is basically producing all these large patches. So one of the key challenges we have getting seeds into these severely burned patches that we see across the landscapes. And California is a poster child for this, right? Like this is ground zero for this. If we shift gears and we talk about available climate, so out of my lab, we've done a lot of work looking at drivers of post-fire regeneration, including changing climate conditions through time. Kim Davis was a postdoc that worked with me for a while. She's really talented, works now for the Forest Service and their research in the Missoula Fire Sciences Lab. She did this painstaking project where she went across the West, destructively sampled thousands of tree seedlings, aged them to the year of germination, which required basically doing multiple cross sections, aging, looking for the transition from shoot material to root material, so we can identify what year did this tree actually germinate, and we can actually pin a specific climate with that particular year to it, and then look at how the climate's varied through time and tie it to regeneration pulses. And what we saw is that when you look back earlier in time, this is just a cartoon. This is actual data from that paper, because it's not the core focus of this talk. But what we saw is that there are a lot more recruitment events as you go further back, primarily before about 1990. So a lot more recruitment events in those early timeframes. And then as you work your way past 2000, you start seeing kind of more episodic. And as we get closer to what's going on now, we're seeing that the conditions have become unsuitable in a lot of low elevation semi-arid forests across the West. And it's driving forest loss and ecosystem transitions when you don't have these conditions. So you may even have trees that are mature that can send propagules into these fires, but now we're increasingly getting climate conditions that can't support regeneration. A lot of work trying to develop kind of novel biophysical predictors of regeneration dynamics. So this is a project I worked on with Zach Holden, who is also a scientist at the Fire Sciences Lab. You know, in a nutshell, like basically what we did is we ran a ecohydrological model across all of the western US to simulate potential soil surface temperatures. Come on in, guys. You won't interrupt me. It's Susan's lab. Awesome. Good to see you guys. What we did is we basically ran this ecohydrological model, and in order to run that, you know, we needed everything from soil moisture conditions, meteorological boundary conditions, solar inputs, etc. And the intention here was to basically ask or answer the question and model how hot would a soil surface get if you removed the overstory from forests. Why remove the overstory? Because what a fire is effectively doing is it's removing the buffering capacity of the overstory. And you get these really hot, dry conditions after fires because you have all that radiation striking that surface. In fact, there's a long history of this kind of work in forestry. In greenhouse experiments, basically doing time dose response experiments on tree seedlings. So putting them in experimental apparatus and like turning up the soil temperatures until they die and seeing how long they can actually survive while exposed to different temperatures and different durations. So we could take that experimental work and we could take this modeling work and we could say, what proportion of the western US basically is currently experiencing these potential soil surface temperatures that exceed anywhere from 50 degrees Celsius and up? Because if you exceed those temperatures, you're likely to get mortality in juvenile trees, tree seedlings. And the answer was about 13 to 20% of our on how you model forests, whether it's 10%, tree cover, 25, etc., is vulnerable to that loss. It doesn't mean that we're going to lose it. It just means that if a fire burns through that, we may not get regeneration because soil surface temperatures in there are going to really start getting hot and will exceed tolerances of tree seedlings. So this was published in 24 in Nature Geosciences. All this is basically to point out, look, the conditions for seed availability are diminishing. The conditions for post-fire establishment are basically declining. You combine both those things, and what we have is a situation where the conditions are making it such that we need more reforestation on the landscape because you have these big burn patches that aren't getting any seed supply. And you're more likely to have those reforestation projects, if you do implement them, fail because of the conditions are becoming hotter and drier. And all of that's basically led to basically what I'll call a reforestation gap. I, Hugh, others published a paper in 2024 where we tried to put some numbers on what that looked like in the western US. And we basically utilized that relationship that I showed you earlier, that large fires have large patches. And what we can do is identify the size of that area within those large fires that exceed about 100 meters from existing seed sources to estimate how much acreage in the western US is in need of reforestation and combine that with information about what's the capacity of the various groups to actually do reforestation work, which is the dashed line. The red dots are any given year's reforestation need. The dashed line is the capacity, and that difference over time is the gray bars. And basically, if we come up to about a number, about 3.8 million acres. So a lot of reforestation need. Additionally, Forest Service has a mandate to maintain forest cover in response to harvest or disturbance. And Congress has recognized the challenges associated with this. They've basically put a lot of money towards trying to close the reforestation gap via the Replant Act, the IIJA, Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. And all this is basically done is put a lot of pressure on agencies, particularly the Forest Service, to close that gap with a supply chain that's not up to the challenge and under extreme conditions that we're currently seeing in terms of how to actually get that done. So let's pivot to like the objectives of this particular talk. We want to close the reforestation gap. We really need to, it's going to require planning more strategically to maximize the recovery per dollar spent. So I'll lead with that. That's really what this is after. It's trying to say, okay, we want to do this. We need to basically spend our money wisely and focus those efforts in places we're going to get the most bang for our buck. How do we actually operationalize that? Well, the way that I'm looking at this problem, and the folks that work with me in the lab, we basically kind of try to operationalize this through the lens of we need to focus planting where it's necessary, and I'll define that, where it's likely to succeed, and where it's operationally feasible. And I'll show you a conceptual model of how we do that here in a minute. And as a starting place, what we did is we said, okay, once we operationalize this model and look at it through the lens of spatial optimization, let's look back at the last 34 years of planning efforts by the Forest Service and ask the question, in aggregate, is the aggregate outcome of the Forest Service planning decisions over the last 30 years or so consistent with efforts to close this reforestation gap, given the lenses at which we're looking at this optimization problem? Here's a conceptual framework to get there. We talked about the climate. No available seeds, probably where you should focus your efforts for reforestation, because that's the place you need to get propagules into, and reforestation is a way to do that. And all of this needs to be intersected with where you have road access, where it's cost effective to do that work. And I think it's important to point out that distinguishing between these different components of this Venn diagram operationally has real practical consequences, because if you focus reforestation efforts in places that will naturally regenerate, that's a redundant effort. And in other words, you're foregoing dollars spent elsewhere by doing that work. Similarly, if you focus reforestation efforts in places that are not climatically suitable, those may fail. You might have to do repeated entries. Also, foregoing resources spent towards other places that it might be better situated to do that work. Let's dig into some details about how we structure a model and a data set to support this problem. So we use data from Kim Davis's 2023 publication. She aggregated hundreds of studies from around the West. This involved tens of thousands of observations of natural regeneration in post-fire settings. Most of this was looking at Ponderosa pine, Doug firs, some Abies species, so fir, true firs, a handful of others. I think we had a data set that comprised about 6 conifer species. And we're building out a model, which is a generic low to mid elevation conifer model that I'll be talking about. But what I will say is that we're pivoting towards doing species specific models as we move forward. Those places with those post-fire surveys, there's about 322 of those locales. They're in these yellow diamonds on the graphic. What we also then did is identify where the Forest Service has done their planning efforts, and that's using the FACTS database. We intersected that with MTBS to identify, okay, where did the Forest Service plant in the last 30 years within fires? And that's about 416 unique fires, about 8,000 planning projects, comprising about 420,000 acres of planning efforts. And this plot on the right is basically to show that, look, the sampling frame from Kim's data set covers roughly a similar kind of climate as the sampling or the post-fire planning sites across the West. So I have confidence in basically making, inference across those two particular data sets. With that GLMM model, which I don't think I mentioned, is a generalized linear mix model. We use variables that characterize suitable climate. That includes things like potential soil surface temperature, which I described earlier. It includes things like climatic water deficit, group of variables related to climate. We have a group of variables related to seed availability, distance to seed source, circular window around the planting site in terms of tree cover. And we had some other variables, which I won't go into all the details. From that model, we can basically make a map of probability of natural regeneration. And what we can do then is partial that model out, meaning we can identify the components associated with seed availability by holding the other variables constant at some non-limiting value and allow those sources associated with seed availability to vary as observed. And we can do the flip side, which is look at, hold the seeds availability variables constant at some non-limiting value and allow the other variables associated with climate to vary as observed. And by partialing those out and mapping those, we can get, for example, a component or a map, in this case for the King Fire in California. You said 2014? Big fire, 2014. that's basically what we're calling the influence of seed availability. Here it is for climate suitable. For the king fire. And we do this for every single fire. And what we did then do is we map these particular partial response relationships onto this bivariate decision space with seed availability on the x-axis, climate suitability on the y-axis. These are scaled to the unit. So low to high, scaled between 0 and 1 on both axes. And what I'm showing here basically are thresholds associated with the model. Anything above that horizontal line is what we consider to be suitable climate. Anything below, not suitable climate. Anything to the right, suitable or seed availability to the left, low seed availability, right? And what that allows us to do then is to think of this as a decision space that's consistent with that Venn diagram I showed you earlier. So for example, this bottom left, either seed limited and climate limited, or we don't want to plan there because it's climate limited. Here on the bottom right, seeds available, climate limited. No, don't want to plant there either. Up on the upper right, where we expect natural regeneration to occur, seeds available and climate suitable. And then lastly, in the upper left, seed limited, climate suitable, and that's where we really want to focus planning efforts based on the logic I presented earlier. And then, of course, we can map for the king fire how many acres fit into each of these bins. About 25,000 acres fit into that upper left quadrant. So this is how we're thinking about this decision space. And we're going to then now use this information in conjunction with spatial optimization to drill down and do the comparisons that I mentioned earlier. So what is spatial optimization? We're working with an algorithm called Forces, and Forces is used commonly for optimizing fuel treatments across the Western US. How do you choose where to optimally place fuel treatments to achieve a whole range of resource objectives? That might be reducing fire risk, that might be improving water quality, you name it. When you try to translate these kinds of spatial objectives into these spatial world, you need tools in order to do that, and there are trade-offs associated with that. Spatial optimization tools are designed just for that. And so this cartoon basically is showing you what that looks like for two objectives. Objective 1 on the X, objective 2, doesn't matter exactly what they are. They might be climate suitability, they might be seed availability, for example. And what we commonly find that is if you prioritize one objective, it comes at the cost of another. So for example, if I prioritize obtaining objective 1, so I try to pick a spot way out over here, well, I don't really get a lot of objective 2 in that process. And similarly, if I prioritize objective 2, I might take a hit on objective 1. And what we're really after is, okay, is there an optimal solution somewhere in this space that has a balance in terms of both objectives? And so we can turn these into optimization problems where we can try to find local maxima or minimum depending upon how this problem is structured. And the way Forces works is, let me see if I can get this video running. I think I can. It sets random natural seeds into a landscape. It grows out a project given some constraints on size and shape, and then it calculates how much you achieve in any of those objective dimensions until it finds an optimum. And once it finds an initial optimum, it starts setting random seeds around that until it identifies a sequence of projects that have that is basically declining value after the first project has been identified. And it does this sequentially. And so we can set this up for a whole range of objectives. For the problem that I'm going to show you today, we want to minimize seed availability. And I've argued a reason for doing that, because basically it'll be redundant to not do that. We want to maximize climate suitability. We want to maximize road proximity. So we want access to roads because it just makes this much more cost effective. We use the Forest Service's maps of existing road networks that I think are a function. It's a good question.
But yes, you can only do that.
That's a good point. Like, I don't know the extent to which how many of these roads have actually been decommissioned and how often they're. Yeah, so this is, there's probably lots of ways to improve this. And what we really want to move away from just using Euclidean distance from a road to a true cost surface, because we know that we can do a better job of working on costs associated with planning. Let's come back to the King Fire. There's the plantings from the FACTS database that actually occurred. There were roughly about 5,100 acres planted in by the Forest Service in King Fire. About 110 planting projects. Those polygons that you see in purple, and they're about 46 acres on average. We can compare what they did against Forces' simulated optimal plantings based on the weights that or based on the optimization objectives that I showed you earlier. And one of the things to point out is that we're running Forces in which we give each one of those 3 objectives equal weight. We don't have to, and I'll talk about that later, but that's the results you're going to see now, equal weighted. And then you can see they don't spatially align. We can look at this in that bivariate climate space or bivariate decision space I presented earlier. For seed availability on the x-axis, climate suitability on the y. Well, one good thing is that the climate, at least based on our model, our generic conifer model, most of their plantings in purple, which are these transparent small boxes. These are the 100 projects that were put into that. The area weighted mean is in the larger dark purple box. What we see though is that the bulk of them are situated in that upper right, which is where we expect natural regeneration to occur. And in contrast, Forces identifies potential projects that are in the upper left box, which is where we want to be focusing our effort. That makes sense because that's what we optimized for. And then the other thing I want to point out is that what we've done here is we've also identified a null model to compare this against. And so what that means is we say, look, we have on average, we have about 100 of them. Let's randomly throw them out like darts into this fire perimeter and see, well, what does that represent? And that's the X that you see up there, as well as a 90% confidence band, which is the dark bands around the space. And then we can look at that along each one of these axes. What you can see for the King Fire is that we tend to be basically planning a much higher seed availability, tend to have compared to our simulated projects. Climate suitability, not as dramatic, but you can see that the Forest is doing a little better job at capturing that. And distance to roads, Forest Service is planning closer to roads than what our simulated optimums would be. And so I've walked you through the process for one fire, the King Fire. Now, what we did is, or what Lewis did, was ran this across all 416 fires that met our criteria for planning projects in the West. And what I'm going to be showing you basically is the aggregate outcome across all of those. And this represents fires from about 1990 all the way to current, so roughly 34 years of planning efforts. This is what that space looks like when we look at all of those 400 fires. And it's basically the same pattern that I just showed you for the King Fire. We see that, of course, the variability below is wide open. And we can break this down by region. I have those graphics, but there's some differences across different regions, but in reality, they all kind of look similar. The Forest Service tends to be planting in areas that will naturally regenerate based on our model. I put that caveat in there because it's an important caveat. And when we contrast that to our simulated results, what we see is that, we can make a lot of inroads in terms of decomposing this problem amongst the key variables that we're interested in and kind of try to move the needle towards more efficient planning by simply moving a little bit further away from roads into these areas where seeds are not available. We can look at that, of course, like the similar set of variables that I was just talking about previously. Again, the Forest Service planning in places where there's a lot more seed availability. In fact, let me just blow through all of these advances so I can see the prompts that I have on here because I can't remember what they are at this point. When we see roughly a 53% difference in seed availability, the means between a simulated and the Forest Service actual plantings. For climate suitability, there's no difference, which is actually quite interesting. And we see that our means for those projects are basically situated in the means of the fires themselves, which is the dashed line across that. When we look at distance to roads, the Forest Service on average is planning about 176 meters from roads. Our simulations, if we want to hit some of the optimums, that trade-off basically pushes out to 309 meters on average. we can look at these other variables too that come out of the model, probability of natural regeneration. And this is a big one, basically. There's a big difference here in that you have like a much higher probability of natural regeneration from their plantings compared to our simulated. The distance to seed sources about 76 meters versus 227 meters. Those are biologically meaningful distances. 100 meters is often considered the threshold for these dispersal constraints on mature conifers. And so those are substantial differences. But one thing I want to point out, and these are basically binned fire severity. So down here at the bottom would be no fire, 2 would be low severity, moderate, and high. And what you see is there's not a lot of difference between the simulated and the Forest Service actual planting, which basically tells me the Forest Service is planting in places that are burning at high severity. But that alone won't get them into places where there's seed limitations, is what this tells me. So 61% of actual planting sites are likely to naturally regenerate based on our set of calculations across the thousands of projects that they did. 37% simulated planting sites likely to naturally. So 61 versus that 37. And I already kind of went through some of the rest of these kind of high level results. What I would like to do now is pivot a little bit and talk about spatial optimization and the trade-offs associated with this. Because I want to pivot from looking back at what the Forest Service has done to talking about, well, how can we develop tools to help them improve moving forward? And so spatial optimization provides kind of a rich framework to think about these problems. So trade-offs, I showed you a vignette into that earlier, in which I said, look, we have this two criteria that we're trying to optimize for. In this case, I'm going to show you probability, seed availability, and distance to roads. This is for the Lolo Peak fire, which burned in Montana in 2017. And we could say, look, we want to minimize distance to roads, so we're going to basically weight the distance to road variable highly. We're going to give it a weight of 1, we're going to give the other things a 0. And so you would basically pick projects that are down here on that right, and these manifest as projects that show up spatially in that fire as those blue boxes. Similarly, you could basically say, you know what, no, actually I want to minimize probability of seed availability. But there's a trade-off that comes with that, as you can see, because then you end up finding sites that are on that upper left red dot, which occupy different locations in that fire, but there's a distinct trade-off between that seed availability and those distance to roads. Or we could choose an equal weighting, which would just situate us somewhere in the middle. Anything on this front, this is called a Pareto front, associated with optimization, is an optimal solution to whatever weights you've chosen. Anything off of that Pareto front is non-optimal based on the way we've structured the problem. And so what we can do now is look at, for example, a set of 35 fires from California that we did. Here's the same set of variables. The interpretation is the same. This is the Pareto front, and you can see where the 35 fires, the actual U.S. Forest Service plantings are. And so really our efforts really should be focused on getting this black box to move towards the origin here, because that's the minimization problem that we're trying to achieve here. And we can do that in various ways by making suggestions about distance that they may need to travel to and within given fires and so forth. Another thing that I want to bring up, and I'm going to be wrapping up here soon, is that I've been talking about the optimization problem as a problem associated with something you do within a single fire. But that's not the reality of the way fire seasons work. Fire is basically correlated in time and space. You have big fire years. For example, 2017, there were hundreds of fires in Montana, over 1 million acres burned. These are just 6 of those hundreds of fires that are within the Bitterroot and Lola National Forest. And what we know is that from a resource management problem, the resource managers aren't asking where within just this one fire I should plant. They are asking the question, well, which fire should we be planting in? Which one should we be prioritizing? And there's different ways to tackle that problem using a prioritization framework like this. So this is all made up data. I'm just going to point that out now. I have a proposal in review that's trying to get funding to do this work, but this is not made up. These are real fires, but this is cartoons associated. So each one of those traces is associated with one of these fires masked by the color. On the x-axis is basically project priority. And so the project value basically is the value, a unitless measure of the value of the project based on the optimization approach that we just were talking about. And so anything higher up has more value. And any given fire, you basically sequence all the projects in descending order along that trajectory. And so you can see, for example, in this unconstrained case, if we were to say, which fire should we choose? Well, we want to pick the Rice Ridge fire because it has the highest value across most of the projects. In fact, all the projects. If I had to choose one fire, that would be the one to do. I could also ask the question, you know what? I don't want to choose one fire. I want to actually do some work in all 6 fires, but I only have enough money to basically hit 15 projects within each. And so I can just truncate this and say, well, these are the types of projects that I'm going to focus on. Remember, each one of these projects has a location that's been identified, so we can go after that. Well, lastly, we could identify a global constraint. In other words, we could say, look, we only have funding for about to plant 1,000 acres. And we want to basically prioritize the projects that have the highest value. And so we can say, look, let's do a cutoff and only look at things above this value of 30 in terms of project value. And that would be that far right panel, in which we're basically looking at the subset of fires that achieve that value, subset of projects. And you notice that that doesn't actually get us into all the fires that are there. So there's lots of ways to slice and dice this, but other than to say that there's actually a rich way to look at these problems and to structure them in the context of reforestation planning. So there are limitations to this. I've already hinted at some of them. Our model has challenges, it's, moderate model performance. It's only looking at a generic conifer species. We're trying to move towards an individual species model, multiple individual species model, but that comes with its own unique challenges in terms of the amount of data and so forth. The corporate data sets that we're working with, facts, really challenging. That's all I'll say. I'll leave it at that because I'll get angry. I need beer in order to kind of process that. And I already hinted at this last thing, which is what scale should we be doing the optimization? I think that's more of actually an opportunity as opposed to a limitation. And so with that, I will conclude. Reforestation decision planning is driven by a lot of different things. Like I'm giving you a lens in which people made these decisions. My intent here is not to critique individual reforestation projects. Reforestation projects are planned around viewsheds. They're planned around water quality. They're planned around wildlife habitat. I can go down the list. Any individual forest manager can make a decision about reforestation for a whole range of reasons. But what we are trying to do here is basically say, look, if you take the aggregate of all of these thousands of projects and you look at it through the lens of closing the reforestation gap, what do you find? And what we find is there's a misalignment between what these individual decisions that are happening on the landscape and what the agency as a whole has stated as a mandate to close that gap and what Congress has told the Forest Service to do, right? And so what we're trying to do is, okay, maybe we can structure this problem in a way to help you close that gap using these kinds of tools. I think modest changes in the planning practices can improve the efficiency in terms of the way that we're looking at this problem. And that's one of the things that we learned. So go a little bit farther from the road and you get into areas that have much less seed availability and be more efficient with your planning efforts. And I really do think, I've learned a lot through this process, learning about spatial optimization as a tool. I think that it can really help kind of translate the research products that we produce into decision frameworks that can be actionable. So with that, I'll once again thank the funding sources and the people that really did the work. And I will leave you with one last decision framework because I think it's a good one. It's from XKCD. It looks at ideas as to whether they sound like good ideas or whether they sound like bad ideas on the x-axis. And on the y-axis is whether they're actually good ideas or whether they're actually bad ideas. And I want to start by centering us all to recognize that the origin is soup. Because soup doesn't seem like a good idea or seem like a bad idea, and it's not really a good idea or it's not really a bad idea. So that's the origin. That makes sense. And up here on the upper left, asbestos is a good place to start. Asbestos sounds like a good idea, but it's actually a bad idea. Whereas, I don't know, putting mold on infections, it sounds like a bad idea, but it's actually a good idea. And there's lots of other good tidbits in this graphic. Thank you for your time. Yes, sir. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah,
If you're going to be bringing things into the plan.
I'm glad you mentioned that, but now you're starting to get down that road of facts database, and I started to get agitated. Because I literally,
Hey, Saul, can you repeat the question? I don't think we heard it, and people
Okay.
online will need to.
so the question was about, another dimension was to think of this in terms of basically plant materials and source of plant materials and climate adaptability, right? So one of the things that I've been trying to also do with the Forest Service, which is related but tangential to this, is try to basically work with our corporate data sets to understand climate transfer distances of the planning projects. It's been really challenging, partly because of the quality of the data sets that we've had to work with. So we've gone out and worked with the Forest Service and trying to like pull together where planting has occurred and what particular seed lots were planted. And then worked with the nurseries to identify where were the seeds collected, with the climate that those were collected on, and where they're being outplanted, and trying to understand those climate transfer distances. And the reality, and the challenge, I guess the thing I'll report is that the quality of data is very poor. And it's really challenging our ability to make inference in that space.
So that's probably the result of that. So one of your key results was that we're planting, reforesting too close to too close. And when I saw that result, I also interpreted it as another way to interpret it is that people don't like to go away from roads. It's really hard to travel through a road.
Especially when you're carrying like 100 pounds of tree saplings.
Yeah, so what if you put that into your model as a constraint? That you have to have the average that people are doing of distance to roads, and then say how much better could you do at climate and seed availability? Is
We
that
do.
something you thought about doing?
We limited all of the area to on less than a mile. So these are just results that are less than a mile, because when you look at the actual plantings, they're all basically less than a mile, barring some plantings of wilderness areas associated with whitebark, and we've removed them from the data set. And so we already have a cap, basically, I'm trying to remember, I think it was a mile effectively, because we didn't find any observations, so everything's less than a mile. The other thing is that I just want to point out is that, it's even more complicated than that, because, our straight line distances don't actually equate to effort it is to take to get out there. Although we can do that, there's, GIS functions, Tobler's function is a function that allows you to account for the fact that it's much more difficult to go down steep or up steep than it is to just go over flat. And so we've already started thinking about that and incorporating that. I'm not certain I'm answering your question other than to say that we have a hard constraint on it. We're not looking at distances that go out beyond that mile. And when you talk with like the contractors and the silviculturists who do that, like they recognize this, but they also know that, we gotta get tree seedlings into these places that need access or need those tree seedlings, right?
Yeah, no, it's a slight difference on what I was asking, which is if you put a constraint that people can't travel any further or even better, spend any more cost traveling.
Yeah.
As a hard constraint, so all of your solutions have to be that constraint potentially needed. Then could you improve?
I see what you're saying. So if we limit the distance that they're traveling, then we only can look within that space.
Right.
We thought a mile was reasonable.
Yeah.
Did I miss something here?
Yeah, I have a question about, I guess, thinking about especially some of the fires in California. Previous to burning, the full fire wasn't necessarily coniferous mix or single species forest, right? There's a lot of oaks or other things, mixed in. And so I guess my question is, does your models account for any of what was previously there?
No, what we ensured is that there was basal area from the 6 species that were in our model. That's the lens that we're doing this term. But one thing I'd say is that I'd say I need to actually check this number, but I'm almost certain that roughly 60% of the observations that get put into the model come from Mars and Pine Gopher. And so really we're talking about is this low elevation or low to mid elevation conifer model. And there's a handful of some, subalpine fir, white fir, some other things, right? And so I think what we're doing, literally, Lewis is doing it right now, is rewriting this whole thing just with Doug Fir. And he's already shown me some results that basically suggest the results are pretty dim for Douglas Fir. And that has some challenges, because now what we need to do is say, well, where is the climatic niche for Dutch fir? Because these are places that we want to actually be only considering for this planting effort. Well, we can do that. I've done that for a long time now. So we can develop models to basically say, here's what we consider climate suitable for Dutch fir, and we can basically do all of these same calculations within that space. And that's where we're headed.
So, yeah, that's a great question. I wanted to follow up on that. So I think that we've known for a long time that, so you're modeling non-serotinous conifer species.
Yes, we've left lodgepole out of that.
Yeah, and in our case, there are 6 or 7 different species of serotinous conifers in California. which
Yeah.
you could have thrown in, but
This wouldn't work that well for them.
yeah, no, and it's not a critique at all,
Yeah.
but I mean, because we've done the same thing, as you know, we've done a lot of similar modeling, we've worked with a lot of modeling, and we're always focused on really what turn out to be, to an extent, economically important
Yeah.
conifers that are killed by fire, and where the seed source is mostly coming from live trees after fire. It can be delayed.
Yeah, I mean, you think about it, like, that's what people are planting too.
No, exactly. So, but that's where I'm going. It's
Yeah.
like, the oak thing is a huge one. And then the parts of the landscape where you can get hardwoods on that is something that is a frontier that we have not broached yet, because
Yeah.
the regeneration syndromes are totally different. The dispersal syndromes
Yeah.
are totally different. And I was going to talk about serotinous species, but the oak really falls into the same thing. Everyone know what serotiny is? So serotinous species are species that will hold their seeds in often a cone-like structure that's often sealed, and they only release the cones when the mother tree is killed. It burns hot enough to melt the resins, then the seeds come out. So their species actually adapted to this kind of burning.
Mhm.
And there's evidence from Northwestern California that knobcone pine is expanding into these, and it's freaking people out. They're trying to get rid of it because it's a highly flammable tree.
Yeah.
But anyway, I don't know if you have any just general comments on that.
No, I think you've hit all the key topics there. I mean, I think the issue about oaks is actually a really good one, and we don't even have a way to store oak seeds for this kind of thing, because they don't go into cold storage like conifer species, like the conifers that we're commonly. And so it's a very different reforestation challenge. I'm trying to work like this problem, like start with priority, like these are the species that are predominantly planted out in the landscape. Let's start there and let's work our way down the line. And we'd like to develop tools that will allow for some of these things, but who's planting knobcone pine? No one is.
No, nobody. But a lot of people are thinking about how to reincorporate oak as a major focus area. Because you have some great work that you referred to here. And you showed in the map there where you at those lower elevations, when you get fires, you're not getting regeneration of the conifer group that you're analyzing now.
But the
what you
hardwoods
get is oaks
Yeah.
are filling in there. And if you compare the Wieslander maps from the 30s with the current maps, you can show higher densities of oaks at those lower elevations.
For sure.
Anyway.
But to me, that's a lens of resilience. Those hardwoods are basically where we're shifting, and that's going to be, we're not going to have the same force, but those compositional shifts will occur, and I think that's good that there are oaks to take advantage of that.
Yeah.
You had a question?
Hey, thank you. Yeah, I think that you're optimizing without a very clear optimization function. So what's really the goal? I mean, like that, or if it's just, well, okay, there's one which is to build a gap, that's clear. Fine. But there's alternatives, like more diverse forests, and we just get into stuff when you start. But even in that particular narrow definition, I would think you would want to say, well, what's the cost of planting a tree depending on, and well, the likelihood that it will survive.
Yeah.
Also, and that's you talked about that, but also indeed, distance to roads, and then you're going to spend a mile, but you're going to say maybe, the further you go, the more expensive.
Yeah,
so,
it is.
So
It's not a linear function.
So I missed that sort of that more narrow economic. If you have $1 million,
I didn't provide a solution. I'll share a proposal I submitted in the USDA where we go through all of that optimization and the functions associated with it. We try to actually work out, okay, what are the costs associated with this, costs associated with time, distance, the materials that you're using. And so we try to work that problem from a more rigorous mathematical perspective, including dealing with, okay, are we trying to get like optimizing like single functions, multiple functions, and so we have an economist with the Forest Service that's helping on that front to help us really nail this down. This is our first foray into this, and we're going to submit this work soon.
And that is another part of it. So what would the alternative objective functions be that you could briefly address you know, because it's filling these gaps, you know, whatever you think for comfort, let's say. But, you know, I would like the most biodiverse, beautiful forest, say, or most climate resilient.
Probably should use our generic species model, if that's the
But,
case.
even, you know, is it even a good thing to do any planting, or what are the other parts? So
People-
they also more that direction.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I expect that some of the managers that are doing these plantings are trying to increase the diversity of these forests. They are trying to like basically improve view sheds along roadways, you know, a whole range of things that have nothing to do with closing the reforestation gap. You know, I'm completely cognizant of that, and we try to like be sensitive around that topic, because again, I'm not here to criticize their individual decisions. I'm just identifying, look, they also have as a agency, a mandate to do this work. And so how do you get an agency that is very like nucleated and kind of operate as individual fiefdoms? Because there's no decision like pressure from on high for all of these individual forests to make their reforestation decisions in a particular way. How do you get them to align to actually achieve a national objective? This seems like a common problem that we have in society in general. Like, how do you get a lot of people with varying opinions to do something, to achieve something bigger, right? I don't know the answer to that, but maybe one way to do it is to give them step tools that help identify the trajectories or the trade-offs associated with the decisions they make. Yeah, right.
I love the ecological lens, like into this optimization tool, my comments are more related to, I mean, we love our spatial optimization tools now. And to me, I was like, you're like, oh, we do it in this one fire, we do it across these fires, and so it's so like, well, where's your money coming from? Like,
Yeah.
But the reason why we do it near roads often is not just because they're easy to get to, it's because we already had, we can take out the trees and we won't replant where they're standing dead trees. So like these types of realities or the social constraints that you put in, like we can say optimally, logically, this is where you can put it.
Yeah.
And as you've already admitted, and I think you did a great job saying this, it's like, but that's not societarily where we want that done.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we can tell them what optimization looks like ecologically, but I almost feel like it pits us to be an argument and say, no, too many people are gonna be like, well, you're not planting where you should ecologically, right? You already do that. This is not how you plant ecologically. This is, so
I am uniquely sensitive to like the challenges of talking about this
yeah.
in a way that is sensitive to like what resource managers actually have to deal with day in and day out, as well as like what even just how loaded the term optimal is. That's why I put it in quotes, because it's real challenging. And you're right, the site prep work that it takes to like go into, and like you can only do that within a certain distance of roads, and so there's challenges there. And that may tie back to the comment that was made earlier, is that maybe we need to put stronger like constraints on the distances that we're going to allow for this work to be done.
Because like when I talk to foresters about like what questions they have post fire, it's like, well, where's their NEPA, where we can get the salvage out? You know, is there seeds available that year? Like, I feel like a spatial optimization is where we're at in California.
That's not where we're at anyway.
Right. So, but I feel like we spend a lot of effort, like telling this is the perfect spot, and they can never plant in that perfect spot. So I'm always wondering how.
Well, my hope is not to tell them where the perfect spot is. My hope is to give them tools. And one of the part of things that we're trying to get funding for is to actually get tools in front of managers to basically look at these things, these trade-offs on their own terms.
So I think, I mean, you and I have been involved in this book, like the GTR, like optimizing, like here's from a manager's perspective, these sets of constraints, this is where we think you'll be successful planting or not, in different ways than you're, you know, and less mathematical, but still like layer upon layer. So I think we're able to say, like, here's your 4 boxes, but we're not trying to say, now this is the space from that box you should plant. And I feel like in some ways that, even though it isn't as scientific or as sexy as spatial optimization, it allows for more flexibility to make those on-site decisions and feel good about.
Fair.
Now you and I are gonna start.
No, I wanted to note that your finding here is, and I've said this earlier, the CAL FIRE thing as well, so just, you know that. The planting in at least in, and I mean, I've done the work in California. I've told you I have a paper right now in review that's looking at this pattern in California and from using a very similar model. And, you know, we find exactly the same thing. And we, you know, did a paper with Kevin Welch and Truman Young 10 years ago, 11 years ago, that we showed that the way the Forest Service determines what is quote unquote deforested is unlinked to the seed availability part of your equation. It's driven totally by basal area mortality of forests, which is ignoring a really important part of the equation. And even at that date, it was really clear that a lot of planting was being wasted. In other words, in the sense of planting in places where there was clearly plenty of natural regeneration available. So I think that even if a lot of this other stuff just gets sort of crushed under the reality of just the day-to-day of the way the agency does business and the decision-making and all the other optimization, the angles that you could take on it. I mean, that on its own is a really, really important thing to know. And it's actually, with your tools, the tools that Kim has built with you and in your lab, the tools we've built in California, this is literally a push button away right now. It's quite easy to find out where the predictions would say, you're likely to have plenty of regeneration. And that's the problem with an agency like the Forest Service is, without a little bit of top-down control on this, you will do this, or you will use genetic material this way, or you will worry about climate change. It doesn't get done except in certain districts in certain places. And that's where you're going, is because in the end, then it doesn't allow an agency to be able to make a decision. We are going to fill this gap because, anyway. I think that's the value of this work, I see.
I think there is value, but I mean, I get into these, like, what is reforested? Like, you really get into the Replant Act and their natural regeneration with, like you said, what those species are. It's not pine nests. You're like, but you've got tons of natural regeneration there, and it's all incident cedar. And they're like, well, that's not regeneration. You're like, yes, it is. Or it's regenerating, but not at a density.
We gotta call the questions for now, but we have the room and we have snacks here for people that want to keep talking, but we want to thank our speakers so much. Hanging around, we've got snacks here, but if you gotta leave, we'll get to your next thing.
And then remember, at 5 in Sophia's, there's a faculty student mixer.
Thanks.